All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to what is the final event of this year's summer course, the distinguished lecture, which will be presented by Professor Samuel Moyn. Professor Moyn is an intellectual historian by training, and his first two books are very much works of intellectual history, the first one being on the origins of the other in Emmanuel Levinas, and the second book called The Holocaust Controversy, concerning a debate and a dispute in post-war France about the Holocaust. So his third book is the one that attracted the greatest attention, but in many ways has many of the characteristics of his two other books, which are often quite startling and remarkable material from the archives, combined with arguments that are sharply put, often provocatively so, from which I think it's fair to say he doesn't usually retreat, but he's often very generous in conceding the points of others. But the first book, The Last Utopia, the first book in the field of human rights, so in many ways defined the last 10 years of debate over the history of human rights. It's, I think, spawned a huge literature, both of people working on more specialized topics in the history of human rights in ways that are inspired or influenced by Professor Moyn's arguments, and it's also, I think, spawned a huge critical response by those who in some way felt that the book got something very wrong in the way that it told the story. Nonetheless, I have to say it was a book that I found incredibly exciting to read, and very insightful and highly original. So that controversy has continued, and in a way, with a few other publications in between, one on Christian human rights, one on a collection of essays on human rights and the uses of history. This most recent book, published in just really a few months ago in April 2018, represents I think another important intervention, specifically in relation to how to think about the history of economic social rights and how to situate them within a broader history of the post-World War II welfare state. And the book makes, I think, a number of important claims, but perhaps the most fundamental one is that economic and social rights can be best understood as a kind of consecration or summation of a political project, but the political project was not the realization of rights. The political project was the realization of the welfare state. Once that political project is retrenched, destroyed, dismantled, rights persist in their legal forms, but in a certain way lose their concreteness and become both receptacles and vehicles for potentially very different kinds of politics and outcomes. And I think it's fair to say that the book is fairly pessimistic about the prospects for what rights, economic and social rights, can be if they are disconnected from essentially a statist, welfarist project. Keeping in mind, as Professor Moyn points out a number of places through the book, that that project itself was a deeply problematic one from the point of view of exclusion of certain kinds of groups of people. So I'm sure you can imagine this. I mean, the book is only in the beginning stages of its reception, so it's really terrific that Professor Moyn had the time to come here to talk to us about it today, but it's one that's going to provoke, I'm sure, another round of controversy, whether we'll still be debating it in 10 years' time. I wouldn't be surprised.
As Professor Buta indicated, I'm a historian. And what I'd like to do is think about our topic for this session, human rights and distributive justice within a historical framework, just to see what purchase it allows us to get on the contemporary. Now, when I say that I'm coming from the perspective of history, as Nihal's indicated, I'm coming from a raging debate about where human rights came from that's ongoing. And I want to begin just by noting the general absence of the problem of distribution from that debate, from the dominant ways this question of where human rights came from has been answered. I'm showing, I believe, two engrams in recognizing that the lights are on and you may not be able to see my slides at all. I'll just point out that these engrams are available to you to devise thanks to Google. Google has read every book in the library so that we don't have to do so, and allows us to compute the comparative prominence of words, names, and phrases over time. This one shows that the phrase human rights in English was essentially non-existent and had very low incidence until the 1940s. And then something happened in the midst of the 1970s to vault it to its current prominence. Now, there have been accounts of the concept, the politics, the law, the movement around human rights, and what's striking about them after 10 years is how they skirted the really important question. It's not the only one, but the important question of humans have debated for all time. Who gets what? What makes distribution fair rather than unfair? So I'll take the example, first of all, of the greatest book in the field of the history of human rights by Lynn Hunt, which investigates how first the French began to stop talking about natural rights and talk about les droits de l'homme around 1750. And then, like my countrymen, had a revolution. My countrymen chiefly used natural rights as their slogan until Thomas Paine translated the phrase droits de l'homme into rights of man at the time of the French Revolution. And that's because the French Revolution had based itself on this newly circulating concept of the Enlightenment. And yet, strikingly, in this first, best, most important work, thinking about how did we get the idea and the politics of human rights, distribution was omitted. She failed to mention in her book that in the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the right to private property was central, as it had been before in 1776 for the New Americans. More interestingly, she didn't mention that there had been another Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1793 that was the first to consecrate what we now call social rights or economic and social rights. In that declaration, rights to education and public relief were consecrated. Then we get to the 1940s, where because of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, easily the biggest number of books has been written trying to understand where human rights came from. And again, for good reason. We have to think about what kind of turning point the Universal Declaration was. And of course, the historians of this moment have mentioned the fact, surprising for some, that there was a second half of the list of norms, namely that by apparent consensus, economic and social rights were not belated add-ons to a universally framed list of rights, but were there in 1948 from the first. And then there is this puzzling moment in the 1970s. In the 1940s, even if historians mentioned economic and social rights, they didn't really think about what else was going on, what political economy and debates about the politics of distribution may have accounted for not just the inclusion of economic and social rights, but the politics of the Universal Declaration as a whole. We know that in the 1970s, something changed in the course of world history. The main thing that happened was not the huge inflection point in the popularity of human rights. Rather, this moment was the moment when political economy shifted and moved away from one consensus as another, conventionally, though controversially called neoliberalism, began to rise, defining our time more deeply than any other phenomenon, since, as I'll try to convince you, political economy is always the most defining characteristic of any place and time and affects much else that happens. And our question is going to be how. And yet, I wrote this old book. I sent it to friends like Nihal for comments. Not only did it not occur to me when I was trying to decipher why this inflection occurred to mention distributive justice and political economy, Nihal didn't tell me to do it either. In fact, it wasn't on people's minds, even though I was writing this book, The Last Utopia, in 2008-9, just as a big event was happening in political economy. So that brings us to today, when I think a lot of scholars working on human rights law are focused, as you have been in these 2 weeks, on distributive justice and economic and social rights. And history is trying to catch up. So I'll be trying to perform that kind of belated correction before you, to try to figure out how we might answer this question about where human rights came from if finally we took distribution and economics seriously. And then you'll tell me what you think. This is just in case you were skeptical that this extraordinary explosion in English occurred in every language that Google allows us to test. This is Italiano, and it's the same curve. The only one that's slightly different amongst those we can test actually is Mandarin, because you get the same curve, but the explosion is reserved for the early 1980s rather than later 1970s. And I'll come back to the case of China eventually. So in my account, I want to have 3 very simplified stages to think about how rights connect to or fit within the ecology of political economy as this definitional feature always of human affairs. Take a first stage that you could call the classical liberal stage of 19th century political economy, the economy that came to be called capitalism for the first time. Then consider, as a second stage, the age of the welfare states, roughly in the middle third of the 20th century, as we'll see under the auspices of lots of different contending political projects. And then finally consider our time, which I'll call, for convenience's sake, the neoliberal age rather than the classical liberal or a national welfarist age. And in each of these ages, our analytical question will be, how do we make sense of rights in the framework of the political economy that's established then? So begin with this distinction. I don't know if it's come up in a class about distributive justice, but it comes from the literature developed by philosophers about what will count as justice and distribution. And it'll be very central to the way I'm going to think about the transition from the second to the third stages, the national welfarist to the neoliberal age. So the first norm I want to introduce is called sufficiency. If you believe in sufficiency or sufficient provision, you believe that it matters morally that every human being be brought as a matter of entitlement or policy to having enough of the good things in life, whatever they are. And among other things, there are goods and services we might try to aggregate and monetize our account of how we're going to meet people's sufficient provision and give them a universal basic income. Within human rights, law and politics, we believe that there's a list of goods and services that are essential to a decent life. And the fact that you have money doesn't matter if you don't have those goods on a list. Moreover, it doesn't matter if you have one if you don't have the other. So I'm thinking of work, housing, health, food, today, sanitation, water. All of these are primary goods. We've decided within human rights that these are essentials of a decent life. And what social rights protect in this understanding of social rights is that each individual has not just an expectation of, but an entitlement to a sufficient amount of that good or service. It's not that you get the best house, it's that you get a house, a good enough house. And so if we're interested in sufficient provision, we're interested in individuals and whether they have enough relative to having nothing or not enough. And if we're reformers who care or say we care about sufficient provision, our goal is to build a floor of protection, either in general or with respect to each right of sufficient provision, so that our fellow citizens or human beings are not living on the ground, having nothing or not enough, and so that they have enough. Now, there have always been, in modern times, philosophers of distribution who have said that sufficiency is the only norm of distributive justice that matters. This is now known for a few years as sufficientarianism, a word I try not to use because it's too long. The idea there is that all that matters morally is sufficient provision. The first thinker I found in my research who enunciated such a position was actually Thomas Paine, the man who made the phrase "the rights of man" famous in English by translating droit de l'homme. And he says, in a later moment in the heat of the French Revolution, that it doesn't matter how rich the rich are if we deal with the basic provision of the poor. And today, that position has been made famous once again by a Princeton University philosopher named Harry Frankfurt. He's even more famous for his pamphlet on bullshit, but they've tried to market another old essay of his in the neoliberal crisis called On Inequality. And his position is that inequality is actually not morally significant. It's insufficiency that is, only. Now, many of us think that's mistaken because we think that there's at least one more ideal of distributive justice to consider, and that's equality. If you're an egalitarian, you may be an absolute egalitarian, although there have been precious few in modern times. But if you're an egalitarian, as I would define it, you care about what people get in relation to one another. It's not just how much they have relative to having nothing or not enough. What matters morally is what they get in relation to what others get, including, very much including, the rich or the wealthy. So if you have any shred of egalitarian commitment, you can't agree with Thomas Paine that it doesn't matter how rich the rich are. You care, not just that the poor exit their miserable state, that their economic and social rights are honored, but that we live in a fair society, one society, rather than parallel ones in which the rich live a different existence than the rest. Now note, you could reject both of these ideals. Most of our fellow citizens, and especially the rich, do. You could adopt one or the other. You could imagine that equality matters more than sufficiency. Indeed, you might say our distributive obligations to one another are satisfied even if people are living in equality in penury. But what I want to suggest is that it's possible to adopt both of these ideals simultaneously. And that will commit us to a certain politics of distribution. It will be a difficult one because we have to care about two things. In English, we say that it's difficult to walk and chew gum at the same time, as if you can only do one thing well at any given time. But maybe that's wrong. And in any case, I want to look at the way in which over time, at least some people, many more of our ancestors than ourselves, have said both of these ideals matter, have to be squared with one another in politics and law. So now let's launch into the story of three stages, beginning with the 19th century classical liberal story. What was the nature of distributive ethics in the 19th century? Well, you could put it very simply by saying that most people in the 19th century rejected both sufficient provision and equal distribution. Neither misery nor inequality concerned them. This was a great age, not just of widespread penury, notably of the working class and peasantry in the transatlantic and in a larger sense globally, but of galloping inequality amongst classes and the production of the greatest gulf that's ever obtained between the richest and the rest in various societies and globally. Now, this was also a big century of rights, even human rights, if you want to think like abstractly. Lots and lots and lots of people in the 19th century said individuals have rights in virtue of their humanity. And yet, if we look at what movements defended and what judges, especially in the transatlantic space, protected, the human rights movements of most note were those around freedom of contract and the sanctity of private property. And so no wonder when Karl Marx looked out at the first age of political economy that he joined others in calling capitalism, he said human rights are part of the problem. Human rights are inflexible because they protect one class, not all people. In spite of their universalistic framing, it turns out that they're a language for the victory of the rich. And he said that for this reason, they are unsalvageable. They couldn't be directed to other ends. And thus, if the rich were to be overthrown in their class domination of the rest, human rights would have to go with them. Now this, I think, is a challenging position, even for someone who wants to reject it, as I do, because he came by his opinion or illusion, honestly. At the time, the protection of the rights of so-called capitalists were those around which there were the biggest movements, and in the name of which judges were most likely to act. So what we have to keep in mind is this baseline. against which any defender of either sufficient provision or equal distribution must set herself. And if we care about those ideals, we have to ask, how can we show the extent to which Marx was wrong, both about the inflexibility of rights and therefore their unsalvageability? But even if we try to show those 2 points, and I will, there's a much larger claim that Marx made that I think I've already endorsed it in this lecture, and I'd like to continue to do so. And it's that political economy is the strong, maybe the strongest force in human affairs. How we make, exchange, and distribute our stuff, how we organize that process, determines or has a big influence on everything else, including our ideas about justice. And what I want to suggest is that Marx may have been right, at least to this extent, that rights are a weak force in relation to the strong force of political economy. If you want to know what rights mean and how they function, you first must ask what the political economy of the time and place is. Now, that doesn't mean, it can't follow from that human rights are inflexible and unsalvageable for the sake of our 2 moral ends in distribution. But it does mean that we can't fail to inquire how rights relate to the political economy of a place and time. Then we get the second stage, where I think we must dwell for a while, not least because it rather conclusively illustrates the flexibility and, for some, salvageability of human rights. Let's say, generalizing, unconscionably, especially in relation to like a very local inquiry such as the last lecture so brilliantly gave. Let's generalize and say that the political economy that replaces the classical liberal one of the 19th century is national welfarism. And we have to think about what it was. Mainly, it accorded power to states to rise above their 19th century function of enforcing the rights of contract and property. And instead, the state was tasked to be the enforcers of sufficient provision and equal distribution. It was for a national community because the welfare state had to be secured someplace in the face of the globalizing tendencies of 19th century capitalism. And for this reason, welfarist political economy wasn't just national. It verged on the secessionist or even autarkic, especially later in the global South, where post-colonial leaders tried to repeat 19th century American history, actually, building high tariff walls, creating an internal political economy where, that involved things like import substitution, where they could establish state power to institutionalize some new vision of a distributive justice. Now, as Nihal emphasized, we can't romanticize this moment, even though it did more with sufficient provision and especially equal distribution than any political economy before or since, at least in modern circumstances of abundance. Because it was national in its basis, this political economy was exclusionary externally. Even more so than earlier visions of rights, this vision of rights was about insiders who were privileged with social citizenship relative to outsiders. And as we'll see, this is a grievous moral limitation, not least since most of the states that did best with national welfare had empires at the time they were founded, and yet their own imperial subjects, not to mention the rest of global humanity, was excluded from the social citizenship established for insiders. Moreover, this new national welfarist political economy privileged some insiders rather than others. In today's terms, very contentiously, you could say this was not the victory of the rich, but the victory of the white male workers amongst the rest, who were privileged amongst national citizens. Who wasn't? Mainly women, who did not benefit from the new social citizenship, except through a so-called family wage system. There may have been non-discrimination norms on paper in some welfare states, as well as in the Universal Declaration, but they had no effect because the welfare state was about the privilege of white male workers. And of course, we haven't even spoken about others to the nation, especially racial others, even if they were citizens too, like in the United States, where the welfare state, to the extent there ever was one, excluded blacks. The categories we associate with human rights of sexual orientation, disability, indigeneity, essentially non-existent, and rife discrimination against all of those people, even if they were citizens, even when it came to social justice. Now, what do we say about what happened to rights in this new age of political economy? Well, I want to say that there were two things that happened, two main events, and they are in tension with each other. The first is that rights were marginalized as a language of justice for the sake of sufficient provision and distributive equality. The welfare states were about these new norms of distributive justice, and yet their promoters didn't generally rely on rights to get their work done. Why? Bizarre. Well, I think the main reason is that they had spent 50 years opposing the first human rights movement, the one around contract and property. Even if they were liberals and non-Marxist, they didn't just know on paper, thanks to Karl Marx, but through their own experience, that rights had been the language of the defense of the rich against the rest. How could they be salvaged for a new political economy? And so as you see, and I think study of the 1940s confirms it very easily, even in places that didn't go fascist or communist, but remained liberal democracies, since all of those kinds of places established welfare states, reformers were wary of relying on the language of individual entitlement. As we'll see later, even to the extent there was a constitutionalization of economic and social rights, there was no judicialization of it. Because even if people thought that rights could serve new purposes, judges were viewed as the least likely actors to be relied upon in projects of distributive justice. And then there's this subsidiary development, which is the enthronement in some places of a category that would have been a contradiction in terms or an oxymoron to Karl Marx, namely social rights. In Marxist critique, rights excluded the social, and conversely, a commitment to the social excluded rights. And yet there obviously were 19th century campaigns around norms from the French Revolution and ones invented after, like the right to work, that tried to create lists of social rights. And by the 40s, These lists, having been enthroned most pivotally in the Mexican Constitution of 1917, were enthroned in increasingly more constitutions. No social rights movements occurred unless you want to count trade unions and socialist parties, which were the main vectors non-governmentally of welfare states. And yet, as a subsidiary feature of welfare states, countervailing the general skepticism of human rights, there was an attempt to create the idea of social rights and even to canonize many of the social rights we now pursue in national and international law. Just as an example, here's the first book ever written about social rights as a category. It comes from 1944. It's by a Frenchman, doesn't matter. Now, this period, I think, is interesting for us, not least because it establishes, at least in that subsidiary tendency, the flexibility of rights and their salvageability, at least for a new form of so-called capitalism. But it's also a moment when inequality is constrained to the greatest extent in modern circumstances of abundance. The age of classical liberalism had seen the greatest heights of national and global inequality. This phase, as economists like Thomas Piketty have now proven to the satisfaction of economists, I think it was widely known before actually, was the period of the relaxation of inequality. Still lots of it, but we know that the political economy of this welfarist period did constrain inequality, at least in the North Atlantic spaces where welfare states were set up. And there are lots of reasons for that. So it's not just the case that sufficient provision in the form of economic and social rights was canonized, but equality was pursued, not least under the auspices of so-called socialism, which, as we'll see, experiences lots of popularity in the middle of the 20th century, including in socialist parties committed to distribution and egalitarian fairness. I'm just going to mention one figure because he's going to figure in thinking about the neoliberal age, a great sociologist, probably the greatest theorist of social rights of the 1940s, named T.H. Marshall, who says, "There's no separating the project of building a floor of sufficient protection from building a ceiling on distributive inequality. These two ideals are joined at the hip or necessarily connected." And he was optimistic about this because he was writing in 1949, just in the aftermath of the quantum leap through which the Labour Party took the United Kingdom in just a few years. It illustrates that there was no way really in this national welfarist moment of thinking about sufficient distribution apart from egalitarian distribution. The question is what happened after that? So I want to, before pushing on to the main event in conclusion, to think about what the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, was. Most historians have had a debate about whether it was a true or false internationalization of human rights. We've looked back from the 90s and since to celebrate this document as a breakthrough for the human rights project we know: treaties, transnational movements, naming and shaming, international judicial alliances. And for a long time, people said this was a golden moment where people embraced the truth after eons of darkness. And then there were skeptics like me who said, but if that's true, why did nothing happen for several decades, not least in the formation of human rights movements? Why was the big explosion reserved for the 1970s? And so it was a debate around a premise of internationalization, true or false. I now think that was all wrong, because what we should see in the Universal Declaration is little more than a template for a series of modular experiments in national welfare. It said, if you have citizenship, update it to 20th century social citizenship. If you create citizenship, including through decolonization, you should set up 20th century social citizenship. What it didn't do is really interfere with the national welfarist consensus. It had anti-discrimination norms for the sake of the status equality of women, the racially other, and so forth, but they were almost like inactive in the welfare state. And it portended nothing about global justice, especially a project of global distributional justice. And then the post-colonial states came. Now I'm going to get very rapid about this, even though it's central to the book I've just written, because we want to make sure and deal fairly with the neoliberal era. Basically, the post-colonial states do something unprecedented in scope and scale. The UDHR and the welfare state, both compatible with empire. Indeed, their main sponsors are imperial states. But the peoples of the world don't want just human rights. They want sovereignty, and they get it by negotiation or force. And their leaders place highest on the agenda the modular reproduction of the welfare state, featuring at least a rhetorical demand for equal distribution, even more than North Atlantic welfare state leaders had done. And then they do something even more spectacular. They try to internationalize the welfare state by not just reproducing it as a modular matter, as had happened in the North Atlantic, with all the exclusions that entailed, but tried to envision what a welfare world would look like. And they had good reason, because the sad fact was that even if the welfare state involved the reduction of national inequality where it was founded, the 30 years after World War II saw the increase in global inequality, spectacular increase. So it remains one of the saddest facts of world history that decolonization served the global rich. And the post-colonial state said that's an offense to distributive justice. We should have equality at a global scale. But of course, their plans culminating in the new international economic order were defeated. It's not that the post-colonial states didn't care about economic and social rights. Without them, there would be no first covenant, let alone second covenant. But they failed to get as much traction in globalizing justice in that second covenant. It remains the case, whatever a few dreamlike scholars may say, that there's no extraterritorial obligation attached to the second covenant. And so sadly, the law of social rights internationally becomes about a service of poor states of their own poor, not the relationship of rich states to poor states. And so for that reason, we should attend to the fact that the welfare world concept of the post-colonial states was about globalizing distributional justice, something not even socialists in the European tradition, to the best of my knowledge, had done. So then we get neoliberalism. And I agree belatedly that we can't think about a victory ideologically of human rights in our time without figuring out how they connect to neoliberalism, or whatever you want to call it. Just as in the first and second stages, political economy is the strong force, and we have to argue about what happens to rights in their era. So I want to make a few remarks about premises for thinking about the relation of human rights in a neoliberal era, so that we don't too quickly conclude about the nature of this relationship. First, and really I think remarkably relative to the 19th century first stage, human rights do not get redefined around contract and property. If you go out into the street and utter the phrase human rights and ask someone what they are, they will not put contract and property near the beginning of the list. Indeed, you probably know that the first and second covenants make up the first list of rights in world history that do not feature property at all. Very interesting. And we know that human rights is a reform project. It's about whatever else it's about, free speech, integrity of the body, etc. Whatever happened in a neoliberal era, human rights were not won back by the classical liberal view that markets assisted by states should conquer all. Now that wasn't an inevitability. In 1944, neoliberal Friedrich Hayek published his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, in which he says human rights are our language. We should recall that human rights have served us in history, and we should deploy them again. He remarks on the project of envisioning a package of social rights as an absurdity, because rights are about contract and property, not other entitlements. And yet, even by the end of his life, he recognized that he had bet wrong. Human rights, not least in the first neoliberal laboratory in Chile, had been spectacular in stigmatizing evil. Maybe not stigmatizing neoliberalism, but stigmatizing autocracy and terror. And Hayek recognized that human rights had not been redefined as neoliberal themselves. Now we could talk about some of the things that came up in the last lecture about the consecration of property rights generally. My claim is that this is not part of human rights law or movements. We'd have to, acknowledge that the European court's jurisprudence is slightly different on this score and so forth. But as a generalizing claim, I think this is quite important. Second remark, human rights have been related to something unprecedented, which is what you could call taking status equality seriously. No one should be treated differently because of the kind of person they are, female, black, or other colored, non-white, gay or lesbian or queer or disabled or indigenous. None of these commitments to status equality tell us what people get. They only tell us that they shouldn't get a different amount because of the kind of person they are. So status equality does not bear necessarily on distributive equality. And yet we can't deny that our neoliberal age has been an extraordinary event, an unprecedented event in the history of status equality. More people have been protected in spite of their prior subordination as rights bearers than in any age in human history, by far. And because of the great inroads of status equality. That's especially true relative to the welfare state, which, as I've emphasized, did not commit to status equality, not just because it excluded non-members of states, but because it created hierarchies of citizens that had its apex at the status of white male workers. Now, this is not to say, of course, that the campaign for status equality is even very far from beginning, but it is to say that it's gone far further within and outside human rights law and movements than ever before in history. Finally, human rights have assumed a protective relationship, at least on paper, towards economic and social rights. And that's what you've been studying in this course, so I'm going to dwell least on it. Note the following tragedy, that at the moment in the 1970s when human rights took off, it's as if the second half of the Universal Declaration was forgotten. The first great cause groups, like Amnesty International, made the Universal Declaration famous, but only half of it. And this is something that we have to think hard about. And yet, whatever we say about that fact, it also can't be denied that in law and advocacy, especially the further south one gets, economic and social rights are taken seriously. And as we've just heard in the last lecture, they've been subject to a judicializing strategy amongst activists without precedent, had no real precedent in the first or second stage. So with all of these provisos, I think we can't see the history of human rights in the neoliberal age in terms of a simple reversion from the welfarist paradigm to the classical liberal one. So we have to think in a somehow different way. And the way I want to think about it is ecologically. Namely, human rights, just as in the first and second phases, had certain emphases and specific kinds of success due to the larger political economy of which they're a part. Now, a young woman here asked a question before about what to make of the fact that interest in economic and social rights advocacy, including judicializing it, coincides with neoliberalism. Is that a causal claim? And I want to suggest that we reject the idea that either there's a causal relationship or there's none at all. Because we can say there's an ecological relationship. And my task in the last few minutes is to try to spell out some of the nature of the relationship between human rights in our time, including an emphasis on economic and social rights and the ecology of neoliberalism. Because whatever else that ecology features, it features once again the victory of the rich and the explosion of inequality. So you could put it in the following way. The sufficiency project of the welfare state has been retained and even globalized, in part thanks to human rights, although it's not the only version of this project. But the egalitarian dimension of the welfare state has been abandoned in our time. Rights have proven flexible in our time relative to both the first and second stages. They're no longer a sham that just masks both the misery and inequality of neoliberalism because they don't serve neoliberals directly. They provide unprecedented status equality. They even are at least a language for claiming sufficiency rights, even if we doubt they've made much of a difference in this regard. And yet they say nothing about and live within the ecology of the explosion of inequality. And I want to suggest that unlike other projects, we can see human rights getting along with neoliberalism in the same picture. The easiest way to put it in the terms I've been developing is that once they got around to it and at their best, human rights activists under national and international law struggle to build a floor of sufficient protection. And that's a big fight, a necessary fight, and it's one that is honorable. Alongside them, in a kind of parallel play, neoliberals have been laboring and succeeding at the level not of the floor, but of the ceiling, which they've obliterated in most nations. So to spell out this claim would be really difficult, and in 5 minutes I can't. You know, since Pinochet, that's how many decades? 5. And there's so many places to talk about. If we talk about neoliberalism in the 70s in Chile, and the 1980s in the United Kingdom and the United States, and Eastern Europe in the 1990s, and India, and so forth, we have to look at each place. And that's why the last lecture was so amazing, because it gives us a penetrating understanding of one locale. But of course, there's also a globe, and all the locales have some relationship to it. And more than that, there's not just the story of neoliberalism in each place, but at the scalar level of the globe, notably in the international financial institutions, which, as you know, have had lots to do with the history of neoliberalism, notably the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And so we'd have to tell stories that respected the chronology and geography of neoliberalism, looking at each ecology and the relationship of human rights to it. But I'd suggest generalizing, before all the research is in, that we can establish this ecological view. The real challengers to, let's call it the predator in the habitat of neoliberalism, don't exist anymore. Trade unions in steep decline. Socialist parties have been redefined as themselves neoliberal. And as for global opposition to neoliberalism, like the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, it was targeted for wrath and destruction first, because neoliberalism works at a global level first and foremost, given the nationalism of fair distribution in history. But there's a butterfly in the habitat, something that's not threatening to the predator, and that's human rights law and movements and politics. It looks pretty. It may attract our attention and worship. And we shouldn't deny that it's doing some good things besides providing a bit of beauty in the midst of the horror. As I said, status equality matters. Actually, it's very compatible with neoliberalism, which focuses on, you know, the public equality of agents to transact. And then there's sufficient provision. And we can debate, especially in places where austerity visits developed welfare states, how threatening economic and social rights are to neoliberal outcomes. Point is, it's not a big threat, especially because neoliberal distribution sometimes tolerates a floor of protection or even builds it itself. What it won't tolerate is a destruction of a ceiling on inequality, but then human rights law and movements don't talk about distributional equality, don't set out to defend it, and pose no challenge to the dearest goal, or at least most remarkable accomplishment of neoliberal political economy. Now, closing up, I'll just mention China, because I think what we're living through is Marshall's nightmare. he believed or hoped that sufficient provision and equal distribution would unfailingly go together, but that's not true. And maybe it's the signature feature of our times that they have diverged. Not that there aren't the wretched of the earth, but extreme poverty is decreasing, and on some accounts, poverty generally. And it's in the age when inequality is increasing. China illustrates this signature most remarkably because, of course, its own neoliberal marketization has saved more people from extreme poverty than any other force in world history, even as China has gotten more unequal more rapidly than any place else. India comes in second in the world. In the developing world, the United States and the United Kingdom lead the way. And in most of these places, you find a similar relationship of decreasing poverty and presumably, though not through anyone's direct intent, more respect for economic and social rights, though not perfect respect, and increasing inequality. The main outliers are certain Western European countries that have managed to hold the line on income inequality, although wealth inequality has also expanded there in the neoliberal period. So what conclusions do we draw from this story about the way that human rights, even if they incorporate a novel focus on economic and social rights, live in their political economy of neoliberalism, not as a causal assistant, but as a companion that gets along in parallel? Well, I would say, we should think hard about the wonderful scholarship that has, been done and what you've learned about social rights. And the point of my reflections is not at all to trivialize it, because no one who embraces equality should therefore reject sufficiency. And economic and social rights is one mode of pursuing it. I think we need to work much harder on that matter I mentioned in passing of extraterritorial application of social rights, so that our cause is not reduced to a project of getting poor states to service their poor, but intersects global justice. Even more important, notwithstanding that limitation, people who care about social rights need to care about the generosity of entitlement, because it is plausible to say that the more generous the entitlement gets, the higher the floor is built, the more likely it will indirectly have egalitarian implications. And this is a project which is ongoing, and I'm not denying that it exists. Judicialization, I'm sure you've talked lots about for some of the reasons that were reviewed just an hour ago. I'm on the skeptical side. I would note that inequality reached it was most greatly constrained in an era when no one tried to judicialize distributive justice on the grounds, as I mentioned, that judges are either weak actors or serve the established powers. It's not that we can conclude in any simple way that the judicialization of economic and social rights in our time has failed. But if we had to choose one general conclusion about the judicialization of social rights, we would have to conclude that it's unimpressive so far, even at securing sufficient provision within national spaces. What we should think about, I think, is how we could connect sufficient provision with more direct concern with equality, to figure out what the specific conditions are in which Marshall's belief in harmony could return. But as far as I can see, very, very few advocates or scholars are facing that challenge. If you take Philip Alston, the special rapporteur for extreme poverty, he's interested only in so-called extreme inequality, in one report, and only insofar as it has effects on sufficient provision. But that's very different than the welfare state, which shouldered both of these ethical ideals simultaneously, as difficult as it is to do so. Of course, as a socialist, I want to insist that we ponder the fact that even in the age of economic and social rights, the age of human rights has been that of the death of socialism, which is the principal ethical language of modern history. Principal egalitarian language of modern history. It's not that there can't be another. It maybe we conclude that socialism is so damaged by its past, including a past in which it was an alibi for violations of human rights, including economic and social rights, that we ought to abandon it. Whatever you conclude about that, I think you should consider that the ideal of equal distribution is salvageable for other causes and need not be defined as socialism, especially when socialism seems to have entered its grave in our time, the time of human rights and the victory of the rich. I love this chart because if you could see it, you could draw a line bisecting the inflection points, and you'd see that while in the 40s and in fact through the 70s, socialism was much more popular to talk about than human rights. It begins to fall at just the moment we begin to talk more and more about human rights. And the lines cross in 1989. If you're a student reformer in our past, you would have been a socialist. Now you're for human rights. And this just isn't a matter of redescription, because as I've insisted, socialism was centrally about material equality, and human rights don't mention it and bear on it only indirectly. Well, I want to conclude and leave a few minutes for questions. I don't conclude that human rights are bad or let alone worth abandoning. Far from it. That was Marx's view. And I've insisted on the flexibility and salvageability of human rights, including for a new political economy that if we believe in equality, we would have to bring about somehow. So no reason to abandon human rights, including economic and social rights, as a version of sufficient provision. But they're not enough, in my view. Their ascent as our language for framing ethical claims and founding political movements and filing lawsuits has been the age of the death of equality, not just really, but in our thinking. And of course, that's where change has to start. And that's why learning is important. And I hope I've made some minor contribution to that process today. Thank you.